I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn. And we're led to those who help us most to grow, if we let them, and we help them in return. Well, I don't know if I believe that's true, but I know I'm who I am today because I knew you. Sometimes we pick a project that challenges us, that looks like a fairly steep yet manageable hill, but as we start climbing, we learn that its size is deceptive. The path is unclear, the terrain nearly unbearable, but we keep going. With every wrong turn, we learn a lesson, and with every success, we gain a new skill. Once we get on the other side of that mountain, we find that the journey has changed us, and that who we were before is no longer with us, and at the base of the mountain, we meet the person we have become. I purchased a print-at-home pattern on Etsy that resembles the corset seen in the images I found online. This is a bustier-style corset, so it has cups which will act like a strapless bra. According to this image, there is a zipper closure in the front, which indicates to me that this corset is not focused on cinching my waist as much as it's trying to maintain my shape. It looks like there are 6 panels on this corset, which matches the corset pattern I found. The modifications I plan to make to this pattern are to lengthen the corset pattern as I have a long torso, and since I'm between a size medium and large for this pattern, I will be making a mock-up of size large and then taking it in to better fit my body. The materials I purchased for this specific corset are a zipper for the front, German synthetic whaleboning, and wriggling to figure out which works best for this particular garment, boning casing, cups, underwire, corset mesh, and lace fabric. I used cotton fabric with no stabilizing fabric for the mock-up, and here's how it went. Okay, so this is my mock-up. The first thing that I know for sure I have to do is make sure to put boning next to the zipper. This is with an underwire, and I haven't sewn these in, so I'm gonna just take it out and show you, like one of these pads. And I think that with the combination, so this is just the underwire, and this makes me nervous, I'll just say that. When I add this back, that makes me feel a lot more like supported. So yeah, I'm very, very, very happy with this. And I'm not going to make any adjustments to the pattern, but I am going to make adjustments to the, like, put boning here, shorter zipper, sew these just a little bit closer so there is less of a gap here. I'm feeling good, oh my gosh. Also, it's very strange, like, here, I'm going to just, that's so easy. That was a lot. That might have been too much. It's so easy. So, anyway, I guess I'm going to cut out my fabric. Corset mesh is stronger than tulle, but still see-through. It's what's typically used in see-through corsets. Before cutting out my lace, I use a really long pad stitch to baste the corset mesh to the fashion lace fabric. According to my research of the 2018 Glinda Bubble Dress on Broadway, she doesn't wear a hoop skirt, but only a petticoat. Now, there is footage of a more recent gown that does have a hoop, but I'm not making that version, so let's start with the first layer of this petticoat that I will be making, and I'm making it out of cotton organdy. I plan to make a quarter circle skirt and break it up into 4 panels. All the seams will be flat felled, and I will be doubling the fabric so that I can quilt the 2 layers together to create these lines. I will also add 6-inch wide horsehair braid with the same stitching as above, so let's make a mock-up.
Okay, so I have a couple issues. It is just slightly too tight because I didn't really consider seam allowances when I was doing it. Okay, I can actually walk pretty far. So the bottom structure feels really good. Like it feels really like when I move, the way it moves, like it moves with my body. This is not floof. This does not add any kind of additional fluffiness. That's the next 4 to 5 layers. So I guess let's make the real deal.
For layers 2 through 4, I will be using crinoline net in 2 tiers with a half circle skirt as the top tier and then strips of crinoline for the second tier of fabric. At the bottom of the hem, I will be using 4-inch wide horsehair braid and then covering that with ribbon and lace. They don't make the petticoats like this today because it adds so much weight to the petticoat, but I am trying to stick to the specific gowns that I have references of, so I'm going with this. I will have to trim my lace down, but I have like 60 yards of lace, so I should have more than enough for all of these layers. This kind of petticoat I am very familiar with making, so I don't need to do a mock-up of it, and I'm super happy to just jump right into constructing these layers. The final 2 layers of the petticoat are going to be made out of crystal organza. I actually found an image of the fabric swatches used for Glinda's gown, and it looks like they dyed crystal organza to get the shade of blue that they desired for the petticoat. Otherwise, the construction of this garment is going to be a typical 3-tiered petticoat with horsehair braid down at the hem. At the time, I noticed a pretty major problem with the petticoat, and that's the hem of the top 2 layers were shorter than the bottom layers. This is likely due to not taking into account that fabric shrinks when it is ruffled down, so I decided to take the petticoat apart and remake the top 2 layers. I took off the top tiers and I cut new tiers out about 4 inches longer than the previous version. The reason I changed the top and not the bottom was because there is less fabric at the top, and it would have been faster to do it this way than to resew the horsehair braid and all of the other hem stuff. Glinda's bubble dress is based off of Dior's Junin gown. She wears another gown in the engagement scene that is almost a carbon copy of the Venus gown. But either way, both gowns are supposed to represent her as this couture fashion kind of gal. To make the petal skirt, I started with a base layer that was 3/4 circle skirt made from 3 panels of fabric. The front panel, which is half of the skirt and made on the fold, and 2 back panels. For the hem, I intend to use horsehair braid for the actual gown, but for the mock-up, I'm just going to leave that out. The goal of this mock-up is to make sure that the base isn't too much fabric for the petal placement. So let's mock this up. To sew the panels together, I chose to do a French seam. This is where I sew the fabric at 1/2 of an inch seam allowance with the wrong sides of the fabric together. Then I trim the seam down to 1/4 of an inch, flip the seam to the right sides together, and stitch at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, encasing that first raw edge. According to Playbill.com, there are 64 petals on Glinda's petal skirt. Now, there are over 70 different bubble dresses, so this number could fluctuate depending on the gown, but that was the goal of the petals for this gown. I traced an image off of my monitor for the basic petal placement, and then from there, I drew a sketch of what my petal placement could look like. I decided to just start with the center front and to get that petal proportion to look good. And then from there, I made all of the other petals proportional to that petal based off of my sketch. I ended up with 54 petals and 6 different size petals. I chose to mock up every single petal so that I can make sure I covered the base skirt entirely. Now it's time to move on to the sequins of this gown. Tambour embroidery is a traditional technique that utilizes a tool called the tambour hook. This tool is used to create a basic chain stitch, which can be very versatile. The materials that I will be using for Glinda are a tambour hook, bobinette, Gutermann sew-all thread, and about 20 different sequins that I acquired from Cartwright Sequins. I will be using an embroidery loom for the majority of my petals, and once I get to the smaller petals at the top of the skirt, I will actually be using a hook with a set of legs. If you're looking to learn tambour embroidery, I have a go-at-your-own-pace video-based course on my website for $25, as well as embroidery kits and stands on my website. Use code GLINDA2024 to receive 10% off your order. Now, let's prepare our fabric for tambour embroidery. The first thing that I do in order to prepare for making a petal is string sequins. You can purchase pre-strung beads and sequins. However, since these are supposed to be randomized, I string them myself. I string 18-inch long strands of them by hand. Beads can be done in a bead spinner. However, with sequins, it's rather tricky to use the bead spinner. You can add water, but I haven't had very much luck with that, so I stick to stringing them by hand. Once I am done stringing my sequins, I place my spool of thread on the bead spinner and my snake of sequins into the bowl of the spinner. I will be using a material called bobinette for my petals. I started by using a material called embroidery tulle, but I didn't love how the fabric looked. When I was done, upon further inspection, bobinette looked more like the fabric in my references. To prepare my fabric for embroidery, I pin my mock-up petal to my bobinette and hand baste around the petal. Then I will take the petal off and baste the stitch line for the design on this inside of the petal. I'm using white thread so that my basting thread will be hidden once all my sequins are on, but I will take some of the visible basting stitches out later. Finally, I can add my design to my loom. For this, I will use twill tape, pins, and the fabric that's attached to the loom. Starting at the center top, I will pin my design onto the loom fabric. Then I will pull the fabric to the bottom and pin that in the center bottom. From there, I can pin working outward and pulling the fabric taut, alternating from top to bottom. Then I attach the sides with the twill tape, starting at one corner and then pinning the corresponding corner and working my way up the side of the loom, alternating sides. Tambour refers to the fabric being tight like a tambourine, so I go back and adjust the tightness of the fabric one last time before casting my first stitch. The tambour embroidery on the petals took over 600 hours and over 100,000 sequins were used on 13 yards of bobinette. Tambour embroidery is also featured on the bodice, so let's dive into making the bodice. I will return to petal making in a bit. See the chapters below if you would like to skip ahead to that. I started by drawing over the seam lines of Glinda's bodice and then drawing a quick little sketch of what I think the bodice should look like. For the sleeve, I plan to modify the sleeve pattern I made for my Sakizo Amethyst costume. My plan is to drape the base bodice, which is basically the layers of fabric that are not the bobinette fabric. The bobinette with tambour embroidery on it is going to be its own pattern, and then the rest of the fabric layers are a separate pattern, so I'll have 2 separate patterns for this bodice. I'll be draping the base bodice in cotton, and then I can make a mock-up of the bodice and sleeves, so let's get going on it.
Okay, so this is kind of where I'm at right now with my pattern. I have a lot of adjustments to make once I get them down on the on the paper. So what I'm gonna do now is just take these basic pieces and make lots of adjustments and then use that paper to cut out a mock-up. So here's to hoping. There's a lot of things that are gonna change. So for example, this gap here, this piece is actually gonna get attached to this so that this is less princessy seam or whatever. The hem, this is all gotta get longer because I have a rather long torso. So this is all gonna get at least an inch, if not more, added to it. That'll be on a fold. This back I don't think it's gonna drape as far as it did. I think I just got a little crazy. So, you know, just stuff like that, that's gonna get cleaned up and hopefully we'll have a mock-up. So we have a mock-up. It is very big. Here, I'll even turn around and show you. It is very big. Now is turn it inside out and start pinching and pinning and getting these to fit, getting this entire garment to fit, because it's extremely big. I think that once I sew up the pinned pieces that we fix, we can actually judge the sleeves. And then once we can judge the sleeves, we can start nailing down some pattern pieces and choices and options. I am wearing the corset that I made to go under this. We're gonna do the fittings on the corset. Alrighty then, with a lot of adjustments. I have finally gotten something that resembles a mock-up. There's 2 adjustments that I just didn't make that I will be making from this point to the next point, like to the paper point. These elastic pieces here, while they're great and they sit on my shoulders okay, they're, in my opinion, slightly too loose. There's elastic in this top portion. I think I'm going to make the elastic, I think like a 1/2 inch shorter, maybe an inch shorter, because if it's a little shorter and a little tight, it'll actually sit places better. But I love the sleeves. They're awesome. One thing that I didn't do for the mock-up that I'm going to just know that I'm going to do, so this that you see here is actually just going to be the organza layer, and then I'm going to do the bobbin net layer is actually going to be an inch longer from top to bottom. So it's going to be the same exact pattern piece. It's just going to be an inch taller so that it'll be a little poofier, so that they're not flat lined. They're actually 2 like pattern pieces. For this in the front, I did put the petticoat on to see, and I think I'm going to add a 1/2 inch to all of the bottom pieces. And I think the top, if I fold this down like a solid 1/2 inch, I think it sits fine. So now let's talk about the back, which is not as cute as the front, let's be honest. So the first issue which we can fix with boning is that the zipper buckles right here, you can see, and I think that again with like cotil and boning, everything is gonna kind of smooth out a little bit better. The other thing is this pattern piece right here needs to get quite a bit longer. I think I got it figured out. I think that we have a very successful mock-up. I guess let's move to the bobbin net embroidery stuff. Take this apart. Yeah, let's do some things. Cool. All right, so right now I am about to cut these pieces, not cut them out, but like I'm going to baste them into my bobbin net. I think I'll have enough to do the entire bodice. My plan is to basically baste around this onto the bobbin net and then cut out a piece that we know will fit in the loom, and then figure out, okay, like what is gonna be the design. So I definitely know that I'm gonna do a basting stitch around this and around this so that I know like, okay, this is kind of where the seam is. We're gonna use this to kind of help mold all of it in. But then I'm gonna draw like the design lines for this bodice front of how I want the sequins to be filled in, and we're gonna work on filling it in first. This one is the sleeve pattern, a little bit longer, like taller, so that it is a little puffier.
Glinda's bodice is made up of 4 layers of fabric. The bobinette layer with the Tambour Embroidery on it, a glittery spandex, cotil, and cotton, which will get quilted together. In order to get the cut of the fabric perfect, I pin my pattern piece to 1 layer of the cotil, trace around my piece with an erasable pen, and then I can cut each piece out individually, and from there I will repeat the process on my cotton layer.
Alright, so I have everything in cotton and everything in cotil cut out. I need to press this all and then get each piece sandwiched together and ready to quilt. Basically what I'm going to do is just pin the heck out of each piece and then draw quilt lines on it and take it over to my machine and start stitching away.
After pressing my pieces, I pinned them together around the outside edge. Using my erasable pen and a ruler, I am marking the quilting lines based on the images on the inside of Glinda's bodice that I have. I make the quilting marks about 3/4 of an inch away from each other. Next, I will take it over to my machine and with a 3.5mm stitch length, I will sew over all the lines that I drew.
This goes inside the inside, but I am just like so obsessed. I'm so obsessed with it. I just needed you to see it. Now I'm going to flatline those pieces and then get some boning placed. I found in my image that the only quilted piece is actually the front piece, and my theory is that it's because it is holding the weight of all of that embroidery, which you'll see here later in the video, and so it needs to be a little stronger, and this is way stronger.
When you flatline fabric, you are sewing 2 pieces of fabric together so they will move as one. I will pin around all of the sides of the cotton and cotil, then I will sew them together 1/4 of an inch away from the edge at a 4mm stitch length.
Okay, so basically now I'm going to take this ribbon and sew it to be boning channels on these pieces, and then we will cut our boning, clean the edges, and place them in.
Since the ribbon is polyester, I can use fire to burn the edges and create a clean finish. Then I can place my ribbon where I would like my boning channels, pin it in place, and it's ready to be sewn.
All of the channels are in. I have made a new discovery thanks to a couple more, I'm just gonna say friends on the internet. I've had a couple more people send me some photos of this Glinda ball gown, and I have learned based off of those photos, there is an organza overlay on top of the spandex and underneath the bobinette. Based off of my photos, I can't tell if it is the organza that is used for the skirt or the organza that is used for the petals, because they are 2 slightly different, and the combination of the petal plus the bobinette looks the same color as the organza that I have dyed. We are going to make 2 samples and we are going to decide which one, like which color lines up better, and then we can finally cut some fabric. Okay, so I think it's fairly clear which one matches more. It's gonna be this one right here. So this is with spandex, this fabric, and the bobinette. This one is spandex, this fabric, and the bobinette. That's the one we're going with. All right, let's make a bodice.
I already explained what flatlining is, but I do a few things a bit different with the spandex and organza layer. To start, I am using a water-soluble marker to mark my pattern, and then instead of cutting the organza precisely around the edge of the spandex, I'm actually going to stitch it down first and then trim it close to the edge.
Alright, so I have trimmed all of the organza and laid the pieces together just to, you know, do it to keep them all organized and stuff, because this is now getting to be a lot. The next step is going to be flatlining this piece right here. This is our fashion layer to our strength layer, which is what we did yesterday. But I did want to say that I'm kind of annoyed because sewing spandex, you need a certain needle, and sewing this organza, you kind of need the opposite type of needle. Like, you want more of a ballpoint stretch needle for spandex, and you want more of a sharp thin needle for organza. So flatlining these together meant I had to sacrifice some stitching quality, which is really annoying. I was able to press out a lot of the ugliness, but like you can still see some pretty bad tearing and puckering here. So I've put a sharp needle in for this next step with the hopes that I will have less of this for the rest of the bodice sewing when I'm using this organza. Okay, so just 2 quick tips before I get back to doing this. I have tape on my 1/2 inch seam allowance because I want to make sure that when I'm sewing each panel together that I'm very strictly sticking to the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm also using my zipper foot. I'm really just doing this so that I can, for the first part of all this, like the flat lining, it was so that I can get really close to the edge without going off the edge. Now I'm doing it so that I can also see very clearly where my other stitch lines are and make sure that they are within that 1/2 inch so that my life is easy. To get this beautiful flat seam, I have to use a pressing cloth because this organza melts instantly. Like it's absolutely horrendous. I also have so much cotton in here that I really need my iron to be hot, and I'm also using my ham around the curves. I didn't actually need it for this piece because this piece isn't curved. Let me explain to you what I've got going on here. Obviously everything has been sewn together except for these 3 segments. They need the bobbinette sewn to them. It's really difficult to press these 2 seams in particular on each side. So what I'm gonna do tomorrow, fell these down, add the lace, like just get those steps out of the way, see what it's like flat, and then I can place this back on and start playing with like how it looks without these ribbings, you know, without these poking up. And if I like it, I'm going to baste this on. Okay, so I have finished the felling of these seams on this bodice, but I've come across some difficult things. So something that some of you might have remembered me talking about in the petal video is that this organza frays extremely bad. And I did add some fray checks since I've sewn all of this. So hopefully when I go to sew these pieces down, I can fix it or keep it from happening. But this gap right here is really deep. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to salvage that, which is really stressful. Okay, so this is where we're at with the bodice. It actually fits me, which is fabulous. I have to add boning to the inside of this. We have piping, we have sleeves, we have cleaning up the inside. I'm gonna be using all of this lace to clean up the inside of it, and I'm gonna do that downstairs once I'm done filming this portion. And then all that will be left after tomorrow will be finishings on the inside.
To make the sleeves, I am cutting out 2 layers of my dyed organza per sleeve. Then I stitch the bobbinette layer to the 2 layers of organza using my zipper foot to get as close to the sequins as I can. Now I can take out the basting stitches and trim away the excess bobbinette. I'm going to add ribbon to the top edge of the sleeve and then fold it over and stitch it down by hand. For the bottom edge, I will just fold it over and stitch it down. Once both are stitched down, I am adding elastic to each casing, and then I can French seam the sleeve edge up and attach it to the bodice.
So right in here, this is where the sleeve connects to the bodice. To clean up this edge here, I'm going to be sewing some more of this ribbon just right around it. And I'm gonna be doing that by hand. So it'll start on one side of this and I'll fold it over and sew it on the other side, exactly how I did it like here. I'll also just show you the couple of lacing that I've done. So if you see here, this is what it looks like versus this. This is, I guess if I put those 2 together, that versus that. This isn't awful, but this is really pretty. All right, friends, so hopefully this is the last of this triple layered fabric I have to sew. I saved you the time and visuals of me cutting out strips this wide of the bobbinette, the organza, and the spandex, and then I sewed them together. So now we are going to turn this into piping. What I did was I measured each piece I need, wrote that down, added an inch to all of them, and that's how I got these. So these are all separate individual pieces, so I don't have to cut and like whatever play with the piping. I just know exactly which one goes where, and we can just go from there.
To make piping, I am measuring the cording to be a little longer than my fabric strips. Then Then I will pin it at the end of my fabric and stitch it down so it won't slip out of the sandwich I'm about to make with the fabric on the outside and the cording as the filling. Using my piping foot on my sewing machine, I'm going to stitch the fabric together to encase the cording, trying to get as close to the cording as I possibly can. Look at it. It is done. Okay, now I gotta add it to the dress or the bodice, but it's done. This was one of the scarier steps for me, or I was terrified of this. It was easier than I had expected. I really should give myself more grace. So I didn't get footage of me hand sewing all of this inside, but I'll explain to you a little bit of what I did. So the first thing that I did was I kept saying I felled these seams down, and I actually whip stitched them. I went into it thinking I'm going to be felling them, and then I was like, oh no, this can just be done with a whip stitch. It was way fast. And then I stitched this lace down on top, and I did that with just like catching the slightest bit of this under stuff and then going through, coming up and then down, and doing that for both sides of this lace. So like on this inside and then on this outside as well. And I did it for every channel that you see. I do have two different types of lace. So this is what I got at Joann Fabrics, and this is what I had on hand. I don't think it looked horrible, but I don't honestly think it matters. No one's gonna see this. The other thing that I did was when I sewed the piping down, which I did get footage of, I on the inside whip stitched the piping down to the cotil, and then I actually hand stitched this lace on so that it would peek out through the piping, and then I used a cross stitch to stitch down this ribbon over all of that because it frayed. I did that obviously like on the bottom here. Here's my sleevey. There's my ribbon on the inside of the sleeve. I actually did this by machine. I realized, oh, I can just add ribbon to the end and make that the casing. But what I also did here was on the inside of the sleeve. So I whip stitched this side down, and then I did another piece of ribbon on this side with our cross stitch. And then the other thing I did was whip stitch this side of the zipper in, just because I didn't like how it was laying, and I thought this would help me zip up easier and better. I also sewed these little hanger loops in. They use twill tape in in my images, but I don't have any twill tape this size. The only size of twill tape I have is like 1.5 inches or whatever I've been using for my loom. So I thought this would work because this combined with this, and the whole purpose of the hanging tape is really to take the pressure off of the sleeves when I hang it. There's quite a big difference between this collar and previous collars I have made. Mainly the opacity and the fact that the collar can't hook into the back, so the support of the collar relies on the wire frame structure and the placement of the front attachments. To make this collar, I started by measuring my shoulder neck measurement to create the base curve here, and then adding how high I want the collar to go and how wide. I will start by making a paper pattern and trying it on to see how it shapes my face. Now that I have my desired shape, I'm going to use wire to create the outline of the collar. This is gardening wire. I think it was really cheap compared to jewelry wire and came with way more for the price, but millinery wire and jewelry wire are typically what is used for this kind of thing. I'm going to place weights to keep my pattern flat, then I will start tracing the pattern with the wire, making sure to overlay the wire at the base of the curve to keep the structure together. I decided to grab some painter's tape to hold the wire in place, and finally, when the outline was done, I used a pair of metal clippers to cut the wire. Moving on to the inside of the shape, I created these 3-leaf clover looking designs so that there would be a few points of connection at the top and a bit more stability in the center of the collar. This process took a bit of adjusting, and then I repeated it to create 3 of them total. And this is where I put the blood in the blood, sweat, and tears aspect of this costume.
I'm finding that this isn't very strong. I don't know if that's a me thing or the wire thing. So I found this, and I think I'm gonna try this on the outside and then just keep our little heart-shaped doodads on the inside, and maybe that will solve my problem. All right, so it stands up really well now. I do have tape like holding it up on my dress form, and a trick that I did was I used just clear plastic, you know, regular Scotch tape at these junctions here. So here at this corner, and then all of these, and then again like at this corner, and it's just kind of helping it hold a little bit better. How it's gonna attach is there's gonna be velvet that goes around the whole base of it that will come in this way and attach here, but we're not quite there yet. Let's get the fabric bit of this done, so let's go back to the table.
For the fabric, I added a 1/2 inch to the outside of my fabric to ensure that it would fit around my structure. I could always take things in later. Then once the outside of the fabric was marked, I actually used my rotary cutter to cut through both layers of organza so I could ensure that it would all be lined up perfectly. I stitched 5/8 of an inch around the top and side edges of the piece, and then I left the bottom open so I could put the wire into it. I clipped the corners and curves with pinking shears, which helps with fraying and with the fabric turning nicely. I flipped it right sides out and pressed it on low heat since this is the fabric that melts pretty dramatically. I put the wire structure in from the bottom opening and actually placed a pin in the bottom center, and from there I clipped the curve of the bottom center seam. I also put pins at the top of the wire. This way it would lay flat at the top, and then I could put pins in at the bottom. I hand stitched this down, making sure I got through all the layers of organza, and then I remembered this edge is actually getting covered in bias tape. I pinned the first fold of the bias tape to the outer edge of the collar, and I used a running stitch to sew it down. Then I folded the tape over and whip stitched it close. Since all of the collars look so different, I decided to go with a seed and sequin combo on the strap. It looks pretty, so I'm happy with it.
All right, so here we are. I think the shape is great. I think these are really great. Obviously, I have to wear the bodice before and like figure out placement before we can put snaps on it and figure out exactly like how long this will be. I have two concerns. The color is a little green. It's not quite as light as Glinda's. It's just like a little blue-green. So I don't know how I feel about that yet. But also right here, the fabric is really baggy, and I'm pretty sure it's obviously because it's too big, like on the wire structure, which is kind of frustrating. I knew I should have made it like a tiny bit smaller, but I didn't go with my gut, and so here we are. So I'm not really sure what I'm gonna do about that. I thought about just stitching the sequins on and then seeing how it looks and seeing how I feel about it. I know that's a solid 4 or 5 hours of work to continue to do to decide if I'm gonna redo it. On the bright side, the wire is like gonna stay. I would just take all the fabric off and redo that, but anyway.
After I hand stitched the sequins onto the collar, it was time to stitch the snaps onto the bodice and the straps. This placement is how I saw it in some of my reference photos on the inside of the bodice, so I'm fairly confident in the snap placement, and here's how the collar looks with the bodice. The base skirt for Glinda's Bubble Dress plays a very important role in this costume. It has to hold the weight of over 50 sequin petals while also maintaining the light and fluffy movement that Glinda's Bubble Dress has. I actually started 3 different versions of this skirt. The first ended up being made too quickly and therefore had a really unfortunate hem. It was ripping at the placket and waistband and ultimately wouldn't be able to hold the weight of the petals. The second base skirt that I started was with silk organza. Silk organza is woven tighter, but in order to get the silk the same color as the rest of the gown, I would have to dye it. This is where things went dramatically wrong because sometimes my chaotic cousin, Space Case, comes out to play and decides to eyeball the amount of dye needed to dye 5 yards of fabric, and it comes out way too blue. Like, So blue that it would never work for this gown blue. The third and final start of this base skirt went back to the drawing board with dyeing 5 yards of polyester organza. I pulled out the pattern that I made for my mock-up and the first base skirt attempt and cut one on the fold and then 2 pieces with 3/4 of an inch added seam allowance. This skirt is basically a 3/4 circle skirt, so it really shouldn't be that hard to make. To sew a flat felled seam, I sew my fabric wrong sides together, then I press my seam open and trim one side of the seam. From there, I fold the other seam over the short side, tucking both raw edges into the seam and then stitching it down from there. This is rather hard to do when the seam is on the bias, and honestly, it did not turn out too cute. I probably would have been better off with French seams, but here we are. For the placket, I just used the one on the Black Snails walking skirt pattern. I cut out a square of fabric interfacing and fused it to my organza. Then I cut out the pieces from that square. I decided to serge the edges because it's fast and easy. Then I attached the thinner side to the right back panel, right sides together, pressed, then folded it in and stitched it down. I took the wider section and stitched it right sides together at the bottom, then flipped it and stitched the raw edge right sides together on the left back panel. Now I can sew up the back panel like normal. Since it was cut on the selvage, it shouldn't fray. Oh no. Oh no, did I sew this together? Oh no. This right here is why seam rippers exist. I did, in fact, sew this together wrong and had to rip out the back seam and re-sew it together before I could add a waistband using pre-made double fold bias tape. This waistband is actually a placeholder for now. Once petals are added, I will be making a different one. Last night, I was laying in bed stressing about 2 major issues that I had with the base skirt so far. The first, the waist is actually too big, so I decided to pleat it down, and the pleat over the seam looks absolutely miserable. And then the second was that I actually ripped the organza. I tried to mend it, it wasn't cute. So I decided I was gonna redo that back seam. I thought that would solve both the size problem as well as the rip problem. To do this, I decided to take it apart. I cut 1.5 inches off of each side of this back seam and I serged those edges completely. And then I replaced the placards and sewed it back up. Now that I have solved the side pleat problem and the patch problem, it's time to hem this skirt and add some structure to it. My friend Sarah made this amazing skirt last week to help support skirts that she will be wearing over it, and I thought that this was actually a really brilliant idea and way that I could add structure to my Glinda base skirt. What I'll be doing is I will be taking my 4-inch wide horsehair braid and I will be layering it up above the skirt. I think I'll add like 5 rows of it. I don't have all the math figured out right this moment, but we're gonna figure that out. Before we can do that, we do need to hem the base, so let's talk about some horsehair braid. Horsehair braid is made up of tiny plastic strands to make this stiff material that can help hems stand up on their own. To add it to the hem of my skirt, I start by pinning it by 1/2 inch away from the edge of my skirt. Once it's pinned, I cut it off its roll and pin bias tape onto the edge to keep the plastic from ripping my fabric. Once that is sewn, I can sew the pinned horsehair braid to the fabric. Then I will sew a basting stitch about 1/4 of an inch from the top of the horsehair braid. Now I will take it back to my table and press it away from my skirt. Then fold it to the wrong side and press that bottom edge before sewing it down. To sew the top edge down, I will pin it and pull up the basting stitches to gather it and get it to fit in the smaller circumference up the skirt. Finally, I can sew that top edge down. Now, to place the horsehair braid up the skirt, I'm going to measure 2 inches from the top of the hem piece of horsehair braid and pin the next strip there. Once this is pinned on the bottom, I can add bias tape to the edges, sew the bottom down, add a basting stitch to the top, gather, pin, and sew the top down and repeat until I have all of the strips of horsehair braid placed. All of the construction elements are done, but before I can share the reveal, I have one more decorative piece to finish. As a thank you to everyone who supported me on Patreon and donated to my Ko-fi goal for this costume, I'm stitching their names
into the base of this skirt.
The first thing I did was stitch out some tests. Ideally, I could stitch the names directly onto the hem with the horsehair braid, but it looked like it worked the organza too much, and that's not great for the integrity of the gown. I tried ribbon, but I had a similar problem, so cotton with tearaway stabilizer would have to do. I started by typing the name into my decorative stitch and then stitching it out onto a 2-inch wide strip of cotton. This step took about 4 hours, and I listened to so many YouTube videos, but once the names were done, I could tear away the stabilizer, press the top and bottom in, pin the strip to the base, and sew it down.
Okay, so I just checked tracking and I think my fabric just arrived. I purchased stage accurate Glinda fabric. All right, so my table has Sarah Sanderson all over it and I can't wait to open this. I'm not gonna clear that off. We're just gonna do this right here on the ground. I've got my seam ripper and some tiny scissors that I can control easily. And we're gonna open this. Oh my God, I'm so freaking excited. Sorry, I'm very excited. I'm trying to figure out which side of this is the easiest to open, and well, you know, neither. Oh God. Okay, I can't unravel too much of it because it is fraying. Oh, it's so beautiful. It is so pretty. It looks like a bubble. Like it looks like when you see a bubble in the light and it has that like glisten and gleam to it and it's like iridescent. It looks like that, but blue. I have no clue how I'm gonna pull this off. So these are the last petals that I have to do Tambour embroidery to. I am gonna put them on bobbinette on my loom 2 to 3 at a time. I have to like do measuring and things. I was worried they were too small, so I referred back to my photos. We always refer back to our references, right? And again, some of the dresses, these top petals are massive. Some of the dresses, these top petals are medium. And some of these dresses, the top petals are small. We're sticking to this. I like the way that this looks with the other petals. We're sticking with this. And that's the decision I've made. In some of my reference images, these are attached to the waistband, like the skirt portion. But in a video I recently saw, these are attached to the bodice. Right now, I'm going to get to the tambour on these little guys. This should only take me, I think, 3 days to do. So anyway, that's the update. That's it. I am gonna celebrate somehow with, I think, a pasta making class because I deserve to celebrate being done with the tambour. The last of the tambour embroidery is done. It is time to move on to mounting these onto organza. What a big undertaking. There's like 600 hours of embroidery put into this. It's been a minute, but we're here. We're at this final little stretch and I am so grateful for it.
To start out, the embroidery took over 600 hours, using more than 13 yards of bobbinette and over 100,000 sequins. When I started making petals back in 2022, I mounted the sequin part right after doing the embroidery. So some of the petals were already done at this point, but there did come a time where I focused only on tambour. So you can see here which petals are mounted on my stage accurate fabric and which ones aren't.
Here we are with all of these beautiful petals, and I am about to spend some time rolling all these hems. And there's the queen herself. This room will get put back together in a few minutes. I needed this shot right here is really what it is. I just needed to see it all laid out in one space and bask in the glory that is 600 hours of embroidery. I don't even know. This batch here you can clearly see has the blue organza. These down here also have the blue organza. If you see this line of sequins here, there are 2 lines of sequins actually that I have to do by hand. These ones still need it. Those 2 over there have it. The bottom row has it except for 2 of them, which are way over there, and then obviously the rest of it. So that's what I'm going to be spending the next 3, maybe 4 weeks doing after the next 2 to 3 days of just rolling all these hems. How crazy to look at it like this. Now let's talk about the rolled hem process and whatnot. To mount the petals, I started by cutting a square of the base fabric the same size as the bobinette. From there, I measured, marked, and cut 1-inch seam allowance. Then I hand basted the bobinette to the base fabric. I took my fabric over to my machine, and using my zigzag rolled hem foot, I will slowly go over the hem, making sure the bobinette edge rolls into the base fabric. Keeping all the fraying contained, each of the larger petals take 8 minutes to do this because I have to hold everything so precise, but it makes such a beautiful finish. Then, from there, I serge the top of the petal. Normally, tasks like this go faster and more efficiently if I batch sew them, but since this fabric frays incredibly fast, I did each and every petal from cutting the fabric to rolling the hem in one consecutive go. The last step in finishing the hems is to hand sew sequins in to fill the gap. This takes anywhere from 45 minutes on the smaller petals to 3 hours on the larger petals. All right, friends, so one of the next steps for working on Glinda's petals are filling in the hem with sequins by hand. As you saw from the rolled hem footage, there's like a small sliver that I just can't physically get my fabric into my machine through, so I have to fill in that small sliver by hand, not with Tambour embroidery. And so to do that, I'm going to be doing this kind of the old-fashioned way, and I have to do it for all 50 some odd petals. Right now, it's taking about 2 hours total per petal. That's like an average, so some of the larger ones are like 3 hours, and then the smallest ones were an hour each. So that's where I'm at. To sew sequins by hand, I start by cutting a piece of thread the length of my arm, threading my needle and having both ends of my thread meet and tying a knot. To anchor my knot, I stitch in the same place 2 to 3 times. From there, I place the first sequin onto my needle. Once it's flat onto my fabric, I stitch on the outside of the sequin, going in the direction I want to place my next sequin. Once I bring my needle through the top of the fabric, I drop my next sequin down the thread and repeat this process. It's very important to me that I'm not stitching through the organza layer and that I'm only stitching through the bobinette fabric. This helps keep it looking nice and clean from the backside and the front side. When I run out of thread or have to end a row, I simply create a knot by stitching next to the end of my sequin, leaving a loop. And then I bring my needle through that loop. I do this twice, and that'll form a really strong knot. Then I will just stitch under the last 2 sequins, and I'll trim my thread, and that will actually hide my thread tail underneath the sequins, and no one can see it. All right, friends, today is the first day that I am going to attach petals to Glinda's skirt. So the first thing that I need to do in order to attach the petals is press my petals as flat as I can get them. In order to do that, I need to make myself a silk organza pressing cloth so that I can see through it, make sure that I am not burning anything. The purpose of a pressing cloth is honestly to create a barrier between the heat of your iron. So when the thing that you're making has both cotton fibers and plastic fibers, you can't add all of the heat that it'll take to get the cotton to press flat without actually destroying the plastic parts. So what I'm gonna try to do is be at like a medium heat setting and just apply enough pressure through the pressing cloth. The pressing cloth is gonna be a barrier between this really delicate silk, and that should help keep me from burning my fabric. Once all of these are pressed, I will pin them to the skirt
and start attaching them. I'm a little giddy. This is a huge step. I have, I think, 17 petals that I'm adding today. They are all on the top row. It's getting real, friends. All right, it is now time to attach these petals to that base skirt. This is a very terrifying step for me. The waistband is very thick, and by waistband, I really just mean like the petals on top of that waist, because I still have to add a waistband on top of it. So what I want to do today and like right now is basically stitch down all of those, and then I'm going to add a waistband on top of them. The top layer will be all done by machine because I will be basically putting a waistband over that top edge, but every layer after that is going to be done with a very specific stitch by hand. I'll explain that to you when I get to it, but first I need to get out my Burnett B38.
In November of last year, I became a Burnett ambassador, and so they sent me the B38 to play with and share with all of you. If you're looking to purchase your first machine or level up your current machine, you can use my affiliate link in the description, and I make a commission off of it. If you want to wait until you see me make an entire costume on it, my next video, I will be making an 18th century gown for the Fête Gallant in Versailles, France.
So we've been talking about this B38. It's by Burnett. I've been playing with it a little bit. Obviously, most of my work lately has been hand sewing, but I felt like this is the perfect time to test how much this machine can take. So we are going to sew through all of the pleated, disgusting organza, bobinette, nice organza too. We got some nice organza in there. We're going to sew through all of that with this machine. And then we're going to see if it can also sew through all of that plus a waistband. Because science.
In order to sew through this many layers, I am bumping my stitch length up to 4 millimeters.
So that worked. The only thing is, obviously, I moved here because I realized that the skirt was falling off onto the floor and it was making it harder to sew through because the weight of the skirt being over here was pulling the stuff out of the machine, if that makes any sense. Anyway, so we're here. I got this here. I'm going to add twill tape to the top of this to be the waistband, and then she can go back on the dress form and we can add our second row of petals. Let's give it a go. Let's try.
To sew the waistband, I am measuring a piece of 2-inch wide twill tape the length of the waist and then adding 1 inch. I am folding over the tape by 1/2 inch on each side and sewing that shut. Then, with the wrong side of the twill tape wrapped around the top edge of the petals and waist, I am pinning and sewing the tape down. I will sew this at a 2mm stitch length, making sure that my needle is going through both sides of the twill tape as I sew. Moving on to hand sewing the petals down. To do this, I lift the petals on the row above and pin them to my dress form so I can see where I will be working. At first, I was trying to hand sew this while it was on the petticoat, and I kept accidentally stitching through the petticoat. So I took everything off the mannequin, put the petal skirt back on to the dress form, and now I can get to sewing. The stitch that I'm using is called a catch stitch or cross stitch. It starts on the left and I work my way right by picking up a stitch in the petal, move up and right to the base skirt to pick up a stitch from the base skirt, and move down and right to repeat the process.
All right, we're back on the floor today because I don't know if you see what I see, but this petal here and this petal here and this petal here are not low enough to cover the hem. So I have to remove them, lower them, and restitch them. This is kind of the aspects in which like our
persnickety for competition. I could do this if I was never gonna compete in this. I could totally do this, but I want to swing tack all of these. And in order to tack them down, I need to make sure they are laying right, or else I have to undo that work and redo that work. So we are undoing as little work as possible before doing the next step, if that makes sense. Anyway, so I'm gonna redo these, and then I'm gonna, after I do these ones that I know are problematic, I'm gonna go through the whole dress. I see one more right here. That one needs to get lowered. So basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start here. I know this is a problem, and then kind of move throughout the dress and see how things are lining up, and whatever else I have to remove and stitch, I will do.
Once again, I'm lifting up the upper layers of petals to reveal the top of the petals in question. Then with my small hook and snip snips by Famore Cutlery, use code CaseyRenee at checkout to get 10% off your scissor purchase, I'm using the hook to precisely snip only the thread on the catch stitch. So I will go through and snip the entire petal off, remove the petal, move it down to where I want it, and then re-stitch the top of the petal with the same catch stitch. Now that my petals are adjusted, I can swing tack them into place. A swing tack allows my petals to move with my base skirt, but keeps them laying in exactly the position I want. I'm doing a French swing tack, so I will be stitching through the base skirt, then stitch through the petal with about 1.5 inches of thread in between. Repeat this one more time. Once I'm back at the petal, I will create a loop on one side of thread, bring my needle through that loop, pull it tight to make a knot. Then I will repeat all the way down my thread. It took about 7 minutes per tack, and there are over 50 tacks on the skirt, but now everything stays exactly where I want it. Okay, so one of the fun like rigging things that I've learned about this gown are there's about 5 of these. This is basically elastic folded in half, and then I've done a pretty tight zigzag stitch across here, and then I closed up the top. They're gonna be hand sewn here, and then there's gonna be a button on the waistband of the petal skirt, which I'll do here in a second, that is basically going to, like, they'll connect together, and this will actually work at helping distribute the weight a little bit of the petals, but it also means that, like, it'll move with the top, like they'll all move as one piece. So I'll be putting one here, and then one on the back near the zipper on both sides, so 5 total. 5 of them. So I'm gonna make 5 more, and then I'll show you how I plan to attach these, and then we'll get them going with the buttons and see how that goes. I'm gonna be making one more adjustment to the petal skirt for this variation, so let's get going on these. The placement of these ballet loops were based on where I want my skirt to sit, combined with pictures of the inside of the bodice to determine how wide apart they are. I used my handy dandy catch stitch to secure them in place, and I was extra careful not to stitch through to the top bodice layer, as these stitches really need to be invisible from the front. The final adjustment I made to the skirts is a temporary fix because I was really unhappy with how deflated my dress looked from the weight of the petals. So I added hooping wire into the horsehair braid. The bottom wire actually ripped through the horsehair braid, and therefore I had to take it out at the Biltmore while I was getting ready for photos. How embarrassing. But a dedicated hoop structure will have to be made because sadly this petticoat isn't strong enough for these petals.
All right, so it's time to do the things that I've been afraid to do, which include the wig, the wand, the necklace, and the crown. Those are just things that are slightly out of my comfort zone. They're the non-sewing things. We're gonna get going on them. It's time. So here's my wig. I have this beautiful long blonde wig from Wig is Fashion. This is a lace front wig. This is long because we are going to trim it. Finding a medium short blonde wig that I liked wasn't working out for me, so we're starting long. We're going to basically straighten all of this, see what the length is, trim it up, and curl it. I have some reference images on my computer to help me get the curls that sit on top just right. I'm already getting hair stuck all over me. Love this for us. I'm gonna trim it a little bit longer than it should be so that when I curl it and we see how much it's curled, I can trim it again from there. So that is kind of my plan. Wigs are not my strong suit. Right now, perfection is the enemy of finishing, so we are going to get her finished and worry about the perfectionism things later. I have one of these nice canvas, is this canvas? This nicer head form. The styrofoam ones are okay, but if you find yourself doing a lot of wig work, I do recommend getting one of these in your size. I have a 22-inch head, so there's that. We have some of this. This is Motions. This is like oil and conditioning spray, so if things get too like out of control, I can use this. I got to be, which is for styling. I need to find pins. I know I have bobby pins somewhere. I just need to find them. I have a straightener. We're gonna straighten and heat all of it. I have several brushes, lots of clips, some of these spongy curlers, a stand. This is my stand. And then I'll also be using a blow dryer. So I guess I'm gonna stop stalling and get started on this.
The first thing that I did was straighten the wig. This doesn't need to be perfectly straight, just straight enough to see the length and be able to trim it up. Then I put the wig on top of my head to determine where to trim the wig. I just used alligator clips for this, and then once it was where I liked it, I started trimming it. Let me just say, I have no place giving advice on cutting hair or wig styling. I'm just gonna tell you what I did and hope that the end results don't look horrible. Once I finished cutting my wig, I vacuumed, and now I can get into curling my wig. There are dozens of ways to do this, but the way that I chose was to use my straightener to heat up the fibers, roll them in my sponge curler in the direction I wanted the curl, hit them with a blow dryer, and let them sit. Once they cooled, I took them out, sprayed them with Got To Be, and then focused on the front row of curls.
So here we are. This is my cute little Glinda wig. These are the curls, and I know they're way too long, but I think what I'm gonna do, this is my kind of plan for the next steps. First, there are like these are all gonna kind of fall backwards. And then these ones in the middle that are going like there's a part right here, and then there's some curling this way and some curling that way. Those are the front. I have to style those with the, the crown, cause here, we're gonna go to my computer real quick. Like if you look at these, like the crown, like they're styled into the crown. Same with this one. I like how long hers is. I might keep mine a little longer. I also love this backdrop, and I love hers. I'm really obsessed with this. But even like looking at hers, you see how like the hair is kind of like curled and then pinned into the crown, I think. We're gonna find out. So anyway, this is where we're at. So what I'm gonna do now is basically set her kind of aside in a corner until I can get the crown made, which is hopefully next week. And we're gonna just leave all these curls in and all this jazz. I don't really wanna do too much styling or manipulating of the hair in that sense until I have a crown.
Next up is the necklace. So let me preface this with that I didn't order enough gems to make the crown, the necklace, and the wand in the ways that I had initially intended to. I also ordered some jewelry making materials that never arrived and still haven't arrived as I'm editing this. So when I go to level Glinda up for competition, I'm going to make another video covering the in-depth process of making these items. For now, the necklace was made with acrylic gems hand sewn onto a felt backing with a clasp. I hand sewed the clasp into the back, and it was inspired by this image shared by Wicked Wardrobe. I'm actually really pleased with how this turned out, and I might not make any adjustments or just minor adjustments to the one for competition. I originally planned to make this version of her wand with the acrylic gemstones that I purchased, and I was going to hand sew them onto black felt and then glue that onto foam and screw the metal rod of the wand into the foam. None of that worked out due to lack of materials, which was an oversight on my end, so even though I mapped out a neat design, I ended up using rhinestones, gem tack, and 3 pieces of 4mm black foam. I knew I wanted this blue center gem, and I also wanted 3 rings of rhinestones around it. From there, I just kind of went to town using images of wands to help with my decision. I also copied this design onto another piece of foam, mirroring it so that it would be sparkly on both sides. From there, I took everything outside to Dremel a place for the rod to go, hot glue all the foam pieces together, and then I screwed the rod into place. To be honest, this prop needs some major dremeling on the sides, but at this point it was either clean up the wand or make the crown, and I chose to make the crown. So it's not great looking up close, but for photos, I think it'll do the job. So despite all of the issues with materials not arriving, this is probably my new favorite skill I have learned. This is going to be a super duper crash course on what I did, but I plan to go in depth on jewelry making when I upgrade this crown. Before I got to the gem soldering, I actually made a base out of aluminum wire and horsehair braid. I started by wrapping the wire in darning floss that I got at the thrift store. Then I hand stitched it to the horsehair braid. This is so I can pin the crown into my wig later. I also used a crown I already owned for reference on the shape. Once that was sewn up, I moved outside to solder the gems. To start, I used silver solder on silver mounted gems. The gems needed to be mounted on silver for the solder to take. I also used a torch that I filled with butane to ignite it. Please do this with a fire extinguisher on hand, wear goggles and a respirator, or do this in a properly ventilated space, or both like me. There's a few kinds of solder you can get. I bought a kit which came with a ton of stuff I didn't end up using, but I would like to learn how to use at a later date. I used the silver solder that came in wire form. I started with a test piece, then I moved on to making my crown pieces. I bought a ceramic tile from the hardware store for my workspace, as fire tends to melt things, and Play-Doh from the craft store to hold my pieces in place while I solder them. I used my torch to heat up the metal, and then I touched it with the solder to melt it and connect the pieces. This didn't take long for me to get good at, but I did have issues with burning the gems as well as reheating areas of the jewelry when working in close proximity to them. I'm pretty sure I burned the gems because they are acrylic and can't take high heat, so I will be searching for higher quality gems for the next version of the crown. Once all 5 of my crown pieces were complete, I had to start the problem solving process. So originally I was going to use flat silver metal pieces and solder them to the crown pieces to connect them to the base I made. I also planned to solder strings of gems to those flat pieces for strength and added prettiness. Here's a reference I was using. Unfortunately, this flat silver still hasn't arrived, and aluminum couldn't solder to the silver. I tried. So I ended up wrapping the pieces with the aluminum and stitching that to the base. It's not cute, but I did an okay job at hiding it with my hair, and honestly, for photos and videos, you couldn't even tell. So now it's time for the reveal of Glinda's bubble dress. After 2.5 years, over 900 hours, and almost $3,000 in materials, she was worn at the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina.